Jackson Hale had worked the night shift at the Crystal Forge workshop for nearly a decade, polishing gears, mending fractured wood, and carefully aligning enchanted mechanisms that powered everything from animated lanterns to delicate wind-up automatons. Yet nothing in his ordinary routine had prepared him for the evening when a small, shivering dragon child appeared outside the rear loading doors, clutching a splintered wooden toy resembling a miniature wyvern with one missing wing and an impossibly crooked horn. The hatchling's scales shimmered in faint shades of silver and amber, wings tucked tight against its tiny body, eyes wide and glimmering with a mixture of fear and hope, and though Jackson had encountered all manner of magical creatures in the city's underbelly, he could sense instinctively that this child was more than a stray. It chirped softly in a strange series of notes, trying to make sounds that humans could understand, and when Jackson knelt down and extended his hand, the little dragon flinched but offered the broken toy, the jagged edges of wood threatening splinters even as the child's claws trembled in anticipation. Without hesitation, Jackson invited the dragon inside the workshop, shutting the doors behind him and allowing the warmth of the night lamps and the mechanical hum of clockwork engines to envelop them both, and as he examined the toy, he realized the damage was worse than he first imagined. One wing was splintered nearly to the core, the jaw hinge had cracked, and the paint across the scales was chipped beyond casual repair. Yet Jackson, trained in precision and stubborn patience, accepted the challenge with a quiet determination, whispering to the hatchling, "I'll fix this for you, don't worry." Though he had no way of knowing that the dragon's trust was already a rare gift, something earned by the calm presence of a human who spoke with no command, no judgment, only focus and care. As he set to work, sanding the fractured edges, gluing splinters into place, and carefully painting over the chips with the faintest shimmer of enchanted lacquer to restore the magical glow embedded in the toy, the dragon child watched silently, occasionally tapping its claws on the tabletop in curious rhythm, and Jackson, unaware of the child's significance, murmured about the difficulties of repairing delicate toys, about how enchantments could warp wood if not handled with the right balance of heat and pressure, all the while thinking of his own childhood and the countless toys he had broken and repaired in secret, learning that some care must be done slowly, with attention, and never in haste. Outside, the city's neon lights flickered against the night sky, but inside the workshop, time seemed to slow, the usual clattering of machinery reduced to a gentle hum as Jackson worked, focused entirely on the toy in front of him and the small dragon who had already begun to trust him implicitly, until at last the final wing was affixed with a hinge strong enough to withstand play, the jaw joint smooth, the paint restored to glimmering perfection, and when he placed the toy back in the dragon's tiny claws, the hatchling's eyes widened in sheer delight, wings flicking with nervous energy, tail curling in happiness, and a soft melodic trill escaped its throat, a sound that Jackson interpreted as gratitude, completely unaware that he had just mended not a stray creature's toy, but the property and more. Importantly, the child of the man who commanded the entire guild that owned the workshop, a revelation that would soon turn his ordinary life upside down in ways he could never have imagined. He smiled, brushing dust from his hands, and the hatchling leaned closer to inspect the repairs, nudging its toy with a careful claw, and Jackson laughed softly, telling it, "You've got a sturdy little dragon now, won't break again," never realizing that this innocent act of craftsmanship and kindness had been witnessed from afar by a pair of calculating eyes, and that the very next morning, he would be summoned to meet the most intimidating authority figure of his career, unaware that the same tiny dragon he had befriended held not just personal significance but political weight, the child of the guildmaster who rarely allowed anyone, especially human employees, to touch, much less mend, the treasures of his family. Yet for now, Jackson remained in the quiet glow of the workshop, polishing the last gears and humming a soft tune, oblivious that the trust he had earned from a dragon child would soon ripple outward, changing his life in ways both extraordinary and perilous. The morning sun had barely begun to tip the city rooftops with gold when Jackson received the summons he had been unaware was coming. A single ornate envelope, sealed with the gilded emblem of the guildmaster himself, resting atop the workbench with an almost imperious weight, and though he had mended countless enchanted mechanisms in his career, nothing in his experience prepared him for the realization that the child he had spent the previous night patiently repairing a toy for was no ordinary hatchling, but the very offspring of his employer. A dragon whose lineage carried both political clout and a subtle, almost tangible aura of expectation that Jackson had unknowingly navigated the night before with nothing but care and instinct. And as he walked the polished halls toward the guildmaster's private chambers, he felt the weight of nervous anticipation pressing at his chest. His hands still dusted with the fine lacquer from the toy, and he wondered, not for the first time, how such innocence could coexist with the gravity of heritage, for dragons were creatures of pride, of power, and of legacy, and to have touched even a fragment of that legacy in such a personal, intimate way without permission was a gamble of immense proportions. Upon entering the grand chamber, Jackson was struck immediately by the juxtaposition of opulence and severity. The floors were tiled with black marble streaked in gold. Towering bookshelves lined with ancient tomes climbed toward. Ceilings arched like the wings of dragons in flight, and at the center, seated behind a carved desk of ebony and silver, was the guildmaster, a towering figure of sinew and scale, amber eyes fixed upon him with a calm that belied the subtle tremor of authority that even seasoned employees instinctively felt, and yet beside him, perched on a cushioned pedestal that seemed disproportionately large for a child, was the small dragon, its scales glinting in soft dawn light, wings neatly folded, yet eyes bright and attentive, and it was this gaze that made Jackson's stomach tighten, the understanding dawning that every action, every careful repair, had been observed in silence, and that the trust he had earned in the quiet of the workshop might now be weighed against the exacting standards of draconic judgment. The guildmaster's voice finally cut through the tense air, deep and resonant like a forge struck with hammer upon anvil, asking Jackson to recount the events of the previous night. And as Jackson spoke, describing the shattered toy, the delicate repairs, the cautious encouragement of the hatchling to test the mechanisms, he found himself explaining not only the technical details but also the reasoning behind every choice, the philosophy of patience he had unwittingly employed, the simple human principle that care offered freely could foster trust, and the small dragon listened silently, tilting its head as though analyzing every word, every nuance, every flicker of body language, and Jackson began to realize that this child possessed an intelligence and perception that far exceeded what any ordinary observer could discern, a mind capable of evaluating both action and intent simultaneously. And it was precisely this combination of sharp scrutiny and inherent innocence that made the guildmaster's usually unassailable demeanor soften imperceptibly. After a pause that seemed to stretch indefinitely, the dragon child reached forward with a claw, lightly tapping the repaired toy, its small voice now emerging as a series of melodic chimes that seemed almost musical, and Jackson's heart leapt. For it was the first sound of approval he had ever received from a creature so young and yet so profoundly commanding. A delicate recognition that transcended words, bridging the gap between human effort and draconic expectation. And in that instant, the guildmaster allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling not reprimand but permission for Jackson to continue his work in the presence of his daughter, a gesture that carried more weight than any monetary reward or promotion could provide. Over the following days, Jackson found his routine subtly transformed, for the dragon child followed him throughout the workshop with quiet curiosity, observing the intricate cogs and tiny pulleys, occasionally offering tentative suggestions in a series of chirps and melodic squeaks that Jackson learned to interpret with patience and intuition. And though the guildmaster occasionally appeared to inspect progress or verify methods, he did so without intrusion, as if testing Jackson's character rather than his skill, and slowly, a bond emerged that was neither formal nor superficial, but grounded in mutual respect. The hatchling learned that human hands could be careful, deliberate, and trustworthy, while Jackson discovered that dragons, even the young and silent, possessed subtle ways of communicating approval and understanding, gestures as minute as a tilt of the head or a glimmer in the eye that carried volumes of meaning. One afternoon, as a sudden storm raged outside, shaking the shutters and rattling enchanted lanterns, the hatchling presented Jackson with a second toy, this one cracked at the tail and missing a wheel that enabled it to roll magically, and as Jackson set to work on the repairs, he realized that the child was not merely observing but learning, watching how he handled fragile mechanisms, the care he took in aligning gears, the deliberate way he smoothed the lacquer to ensure that magical resonance would not fracture under stress, and in a small, almost imperceptible gesture, the hatchling's tiny claws assisted, holding the toy steady as if trying to emulate the human's meticulous patience, and Jackson could not help but smile at the irony. A creature capable of both fire and flight, child whose heritage demanded respect and obedience, was now humbly learning craft and precision from a human janitor. A reminder that skill and empathy were sometimes more powerful than birthright or instinct. As weeks passed, the bond deepened into an unspoken collaboration, toys repaired and rebuilt under careful guidance, each creation more complex than the last, blending mechanical ingenuity with subtle enchantments that even the guild's most senior artificers marveled at, and Jackson began to notice changes not only in the hatchling's behavior but also in the way the workshop responded. Cogs seemed to turn more smoothly, enchantments flowed with steadier resonance, and a quiet harmony settled over the night shift, as though the mutual trust between human and dragon was echoing through every gear and pulley, infusing the tools and machines with a sense of cohesion that had previously been absent. And yet, amid these small victories, Jackson remained blissfully unaware of the broader implications, that by earning the trust of the dragon child, he had unknowingly positioned himself at the center of political and magical influence within the guild. For the child was not merely a dependent of the guildmaster but an heir, whose approval and judgment carried consequences far beyond the workshop, a fact that would soon become clear when a series of minor mishaps, inexplicable mechanical failures, and whispered questions in the council chambers prompted an investigation that inevitably traced back to the source of the child's favor, and Jackson, humble and unassuming, would soon learn that simple acts of care, patience, observation, and attentiveness to a broken toy could ripple outward to affect decisions of power, alliances, and even the future of the guild itself. Yet for now, he continued his quiet work, unaware of the storm of politics about to intersect with the delicate trust he had cultivated in the soft glow of the workshop, unaware that the small dragon he had befriended would soon reveal that sometimes influence is not granted by position, title, or authority, but by the courage to act with genuine care in the simplest of moments, a lesson that Jackson had embodied without even knowing it, one repaired toy at a time. Weeks passed and Jackson's life at the Crystal Forge workshop had subtly but irrevocably shifted. The once obvious division between human janitor and dragonborn heir blurred as the hatchling's trust deepened into a peculiar, unspoken partnership, and while Jackson continued to repair toys, realign enchanted gears, and polish delicate mechanisms that kept the entire guild's machinery running, he began to notice that the small dragon child, whom he had believed to be merely curious, was displaying remarkable initiative, selecting toys and mechanisms to observe, tilting its head critically, and occasionally nudging pieces into place with a precision and awareness that seemed impossibly advanced for its age. And Jackson realized with a mixture of awe and unease that the child was studying not just the craft but the principles behind it, evaluating cause and effect, anticipating problems, and mentally simulating solutions in ways that rivaled the most skilled artificers in the guild. And though Jackson never treated the child as subordinate or student, the dynamic had shifted to one of collaborative mentorship, with lessons flowing in both directions, teaching patience, perception, and care, and Jackson found himself instinctively explaining not only techniques but the underlying reasoning, the philosophy of human attention, the subtle rhythm that guides hands and heart in concert, all while the hatchling's gaze remained fixed, absorbing every detail with a sharp, silent intensity that was humbling yet exhilarating, for he had never before felt the weight of being observed with such analytical rigor, and yet so tenderly, for despite its scrutiny, the child's small wings twitched with delight at every clever repair or delicate alignment, and Jackson laughed softly, knowing that amusement and precision could coexist. One evening, as rain lashed against the towering windows and the workshop was filled with the gentle hiss of steam rising from magical polishing apparatuses, Jackson set a particularly intricate toy upon the table, a miniature dragon automaton whose wings flapped with precise timing when wound and whose tiny flame projection relied on a delicate alchemy of heat and resonance. And the hatchling leaned in close, small claws hovering over the toy with nervous anticipation, clearly weighing the proper sequence of winding, triggering, and adjusting. And Jackson, seeing this, offered guidance in low, quiet words, demonstrating step by step, while resisting the urge to intervene prematurely, trusting the child to internalize the procedure, knowing that mastery could not be rushed. And as the automaton finally sprang to life, flapping its wings and emitting a miniature blaze that danced harmlessly across the polished table, the hatchling chirped in a high, musical series of notes, tail flicking excitedly, and even the soft glow of scales seemed to pulse in happiness, and Jackson realized in that instant that their partnership had created a space where growth was possible for both human and dragon, an environment forged not from authority but from empathy, observation, and shared curiosity. Yet the apparent simplicity of these moments masked a growing tension, for word of Jackson's unusual access to the dragon child inevitably reached the guild's inner council, composed of senior dragonborn leaders and human artificers who had long operated under rigid hierarchies and strict adherence to protocol. And, while some admired the evident skill and patience of the human, others whispered doubts and raised questions about propriety, influence, and oversight, arguing that no child, regardless of heritage, should be granted the freedom to allow a human such proximity, nor should a human be in a position to shape the child's understanding of craft, magic, or decision-making. And though Jackson remained blissfully unaware of these murmurs, the political undercurrents of the guild began to shift. Imperceptibly, the balance of power subtly adjusting in response to the trust he had earned. A trust that was invisible to the unobservant but undeniable to those who understood the stakes. One afternoon, as Jackson calibrated a wind-up mechanical bird whose tiny wings carried sparks of controlled flame, the hatchling climbed atop the workbench, observing intently, and in a gesture that startled Jackson, reached forward and touched his hand, placing it on the bird to feel the warmth and vibrations transmitted through the mechanisms, and in that contact, Jackson felt a pulse of awareness, a recognition that the child had internalized lessons far beyond mechanics alone, understanding timing, force, and subtle magical resonance intuitively, and he realized that he was no longer merely repairing toys, but mentoring a being whose intellect and perception could one day surpass all guild expectations, and he felt an odd mixture of pride and responsibility, knowing that every careful action, every patient demonstration, and every quiet word spoken in the glow of the workshop had contributed to a formative experience whose consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of Crystal Forge. But tranquility, as it often does in the lives of those intertwined with dragons, was never permanent. For one evening, as Jackson was storing tools and the hatchling practiced assembling a delicate automaton unaided for the first time, the heavy double doors of the workshop swung open with authority, revealing the guildmaster flanked by two senior council members, their eyes blazing with scrutiny and calculation, and Jackson's pulse quickened, aware instinctively that this visit was no ordinary inspection, for the council had apparently resolved to assess not only the child's progress but the human's influence, to determine whether Jackson's freedom within the workshop had gone too far, potentially endangering tradition, hierarchy, and protocol. And the room seemed to grow colder, the ambient hum of enchanted machinery muted by the tension, while the hatchling froze mid-motion, wings curling slightly, and Jackson, despite his years of experience with magical beings and enchanted devices, felt the weight of expectation press upon him as he straightened and bowed politely, explaining the procedures of the evening with precise clarity, careful not to overstate his role yet fully demonstrating the partnership that had developed. And the guildmaster studied both human and dragon child in silence, eyes narrowing, while the council members whispered in low, sibilant tones, and in that suspended moment, Jackson realized that what had begun as a simple act of repairing a broken toy had become a nexus point of trust, skill, and influence that no one, not even he, had anticipated, and as the tension stretched, the hatchling made a small, deliberate chirp, lifting the repaired automaton slightly in a gesture of demonstration, and the room seemed to exhale, the subtle display of approval acting as a reminder that power sometimes resides not in status, authority, or fear, but in the quiet acknowledgement of skill and integrity, and Jackson understood that this moment, fragile and tense as it was, might define his relationship with the guild, the child, and the future course of the kingdom itself, for influence could be earned through empathy, patience, and care, and though he had begun as nothing more than a human janitor, a humble craftsman, he was on the cusp of proving that such virtues could alter not only machines but hearts, hierarchies, and the very expectations of dragonkind. The weeks that followed the council's tense visit became a crucible of growth, for Jackson found himself navigating a delicate balance between his ordinary duties as a janitor and the extraordinary responsibility of nurturing the dragon child's emerging intellect. Each day a careful choreography of repairing broken mechanisms, demonstrating precision and patience, and quietly observing how the hatchling absorbed lessons not only of craft but of judgment, consequence, and ethical choice. And, though the guildmaster rarely intervened directly, his presence loomed like a constant measure of scrutiny, his amber eyes reflecting every decision made, weighing human ingenuity against draconic expectation. And in this charged atmosphere, Jackson began to notice subtle but profound changes. The child, once timid and reactive, now approached challenges with calm deliberation, selecting tools, adjusting mechanisms, and even suggesting minor improvements that enhanced both function and magical resonance. And Jackson, humbled and astonished, realized that what he had initially thought of as simple toy repair had transformed into a mentorship that bridged species, heritage, and power, a partnership in which empathy and patience were more potent than authority or command. And as the hatchling's competence and confidence grew, whispers began circulating among guild members and visiting dragon dignitaries alike, marveling at the unusual dynamic that had taken root in the workshop, a relationship built on respect rather than hierarchy, trust rather than fear. And while some still questioned its propriety, the results were undeniable, from flawlessly calibrated automata to innovative enchantments inspired by human logic applied to draconic magical principles. Yet Jackson remained largely oblivious to these accolades, focused instead on the satisfaction of seeing the child succeed through effort, curiosity, and the confidence fostered by a simple act of kindness that had started with a broken toy. One evening, as twilight painted the city with shades of amber and violet, a crisis arrived that would test everything the human and the hatchling had cultivated. A powerful guild emissary, sent from a neighboring city of firebound dragons, demanded a demonstration of competence, expecting obedience, showmanship, and traditional displays of dragonborn prowess. And the hatchling, understanding both the stakes and the expectations, approached the challenge with measured calm, signaling Jackson to prepare the mechanisms and devices for demonstration. And as they began, it became clear that this was no ordinary test, for the emissary's eyes were sharp, scrutinizing every gesture, every movement, every application of skill. Yet the child handled each task flawlessly, combining mechanical precision with subtle magical enhancements that created effects both elegant and controlled. Sparks of flame harmonized with soft metallic resonance, gears spinning in perfect timing with the child's motions, the entire performance a seamless fusion of human ingenuity and dragon instinct. And Jackson, assisting unobtrusively, marveled at the synthesis, realizing that he was witnessing a new standard of excellence born not from raw force but from collaboration, patience, and empathy. And as the demonstration concluded, the emissary rose to his full height, wings extending in astonishment, and for the first time, acknowledged with a bow that the hatchling's approach, tempered, precise, and thoughtful, was superior not because it replicated traditional power but because it surpassed it through mastery and understanding. And in that moment Jackson's quiet satisfaction swelled, for he understood that his unassuming care and encouragement had enabled the child to shine not under coercion but under empowerment. The following day, the guildmaster himself addressed the entire workshop, praising the combination of diligence, innovation, and mentorship that had transformed not only the hatchling's skill but the operational efficiency of the guild's mechanisms and enchantments. And he singled out Jackson, not as a mere janitor but as a critical influence, a human whose patient guidance had catalyzed growth, innovation, and harmony, a revelation that rippled through the workshop like controlled fire, inspiring humans and dragons alike to reconsider the boundaries of hierarchy, influence, and the capacity for learning across species. As months passed, the hatchling continued to mature, assuming increasing responsibility within the guild. And Jackson, now recognized as a trusted advisor and mentor, balanced his work with the quiet joy of watching the child flourish, from assembling intricate automata to innovating magical devices that blended technical craftsmanship with draconic power. And the workshops themselves transformed, once purely utilitarian spaces now vibrant with experimentation, collaboration, and the harmonious mingling of species, skills, and perspectives, a testament to the profound impact that a simple act of care, repairing a broken toy, could have when combined with trust, patience, and encouragement. And on quiet evenings, when the workshop lights glimmered against polished floors and the hum of machinery created a comforting rhythm, Jackson would catch the hatchling practicing alone, adjusting gears with meticulous precision, wings twitching with concentration, eyes bright with curiosity. And he realized that the child's brilliance was no longer just a reflection of heritage but a living product of guidance, empathy, and the courage to act with care. And as he reflected on the journey, he understood that in a world of dragons, magic, and expectation, true strength often emerged from the simplest acts, the smallest gestures, and the willingness to see someone as capable, talented, and intelligent, even when tradition, hierarchy, or pride might dictate otherwise, and that the tiny, broken toy he had repaired that first night had become the foundation not only of a personal bond but of a legacy that would resonate through the guild for generations, proving that heroism, influence, and the power to shape the future sometimes lie in patience, compassion, and the quiet diligence of a human willing to treat a dragon child not as a burden, a symbol, or an heir, but as a young being with potential to be nurtured, respected, and elevated. And as Jackson watched the hatchling soar through the workshop with wings fully extended, each motion confident and deliberate, he understood finally that sometimes the smallest kindness can ignite the greatest change, that empathy can surpass expectation, and that in the interplay between care, skill, and trust, even the most unassuming human can leave an indelible mark on a world of dragons, magic, and power, a mark that would endure long after the hum of machinery faded into legend.